Welcome to BrainTalk, a podcast from Project BrainStorm about the bipolar spectrum. Your hosts are Dr. Jim Phelps, a psychiatrist and author of several groundbreaking books about bipolar, and Sara Schley, author of the memoir Brainstorm, From Broken to Blessed on the Bipolar Spectrum, and co-creator of Brainstorm the Film, coming to you in 2025. Here on BrainTalk, we'll interview new experts each week about their research and expertise within bipolar, and listeners will call in to ask questions. Let's work together to save lives, end the stigma, and create healing for everyone on the bipolar spectrum and those who love them.
Hey, Jim.
Hello. Hey, Sarah.
I don't know if everybody knows, I'm in the East Coast, you're on the West Coast. And you know, it's funny, I'm actually facing due west. I never thought about that. So I really am looking at you. My desk
Well, that's
faces
interesting,
west.
Sarah, because I am facing due east, so I'm looking at you.
Oh my goodness. That's why this works so well.
Yeah.
Well, today we have a super interesting guest. His name is Paul English, and he's, I think, most famous as one of the co-founders of kayak.com. You know kayak.com?
Right. Where am I going to stay? Hotel, airline?
Yeah, that thing. He's also a man who lives with bipolar. He's done a lot of amazing, innovative things to support our community. You ready to talk to Paul?
Let's do.
Okay, let's get him on the show. Hey, Paul English, welcome to Brain Talk. We're so grateful to have you on the show this morning.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Sarah. And hi, Jim. How are you?
Thank you very much for coming. Nice to meet you, Paul.
So, Paul, if we could just start by asking you something about your personal story with bipolarity and where did that begin for you and anything you want to share about living with bipolar.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in West Roxbury. We had a family of 9. My parents had 7 kids. There were 9 of us in a 3-bedroom house. It was very tight quarters. And a lot of growing up in a house like that is just finding your way in the world and finding your way in the family. And 2 of my siblings have gone on to become therapists. I think being in that tinderbox and reading emotions is really important, at the beginning. And I first got diagnosed at age 25. I think within a month, I got married, bought a new house, started a new job, and got a master's degree all in the same month.
Wow.
And I burnt out bad and started having panic attacks and just a lot of what today I would call hypomanic episodes where I disconnected from people. And that began the search for treatment when I was 25.
And what do you remember about the years before 25? In retrospect, can you see a pattern of mood stuff going on even prior to that?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely also have some ADHD. I got thrown out of school a few times as a kid. They asked my mother to put me in a different school. I was bored in school and I was a little bit of a wise guy. So I had to bounce around schools. And then the only other thing that I think I had strong emotional memory for is I used to be quick to anger and get angry as a teenager and probably in my 20s. And over the years, I've learned through study as Buddhism how to get rid of almost all anger. And I know that anger can be a symptom of a bipolar episode as well, that we can get irritated and angry. But I've done a pretty good job controlling that. Not 100%, but I've done a pretty good job.
Jim, and other points you and I have talked about, anger, and at least in my case, it's almost like a bellwether, or the canary in the coal mine. If I start to notice myself being irritable, that's an indicator that I have to do some basics to get back to stability. So, Paul, and you've written about this too. Do you want to share with us a little bit more your practice?
I look at anger as a choice, and I'm sure you both know the Buddhist saying that being angry at someone else is like drinking poison and expecting them to die. And once we realize that anger is hurting our soul, I would say creating tumors in our soul, we should say, whoa, why would I do that? So if you were driving down the road and there's a hammer in the seat next to you and someone cut you off in traffic, would you pick up the hammer and hit yourself in the head? That makes no sense. But when you're screaming at them, that's what you're doing, is you're creating, I would say, tumors in the soul, and maybe more than the soul. And so what I learned to do is to forgive everyone and everything, sort of radical acceptance. I'm a big fan of the serenity prayer. And through the study of Buddhism and radical acceptance and just how to exist in turbulent times, I've learned how to surf that wave rather than fight it.
surfing the wave, meaning you're using that energy. You're not just
Yeah.
trying to avoid it.
Yeah.
If you look Paul up, he's probably got a Wikipedia page a couple pages long. I haven't looked it up, but you've done amazing work along your career, both in the for-profit and the not-for-profit sector. I think the job you're most famous for, perhaps, is the founding of Kayak, or co-founding. Every time I say anything about you, Paul, because of Boston Bipolar Social Club, which we'll get into in a minute, I'll say, the guy who founded Kayak. They'll go, oh, yeah, I know Kayak. So tell us a little bit about, like your entrepreneurial spirit, things that you've done.
I'll tell you a funny story about my affiliation with Kayak. It was 10 years of my life. I was 40 when we started it. And it was an incredibly fun 10 years. I was definitely hypomanic during much of that time, if not most of it. And had some issues, but also helped me in my career. But as far as like being called the Kayak Guy, I just have a funny story. I started a nonprofit in Boston 6 years ago called Embrace Boston, and we built a memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King because their love story started in Boston. Anyway, recently I was at a bar, and I just come from an MLK event, and I had a little pin on my collar. There was the logo for Embrace Boston. And the bartender recognized it and said, oh my God, my family was so moved that Boston actually did that, because we talked about it for decades. And the fact that there's enough concerned people to make a memorial that major and that beautiful in the center of the city just like meant everything to my family. He said my mother met Dr. King in the 50s, and we always talked about him. So I said, well, I'm actually the founder of Embrace Boston. You can have my pin. And I gave it to him, and he started crying. And no one ever cried when I told him I made Kayak. Unless I screwed up their honeymoon or something.
Well, we're going to show a picture of the Embrace statue because it's very stunning. For any of you who've ever been to Boston or could come to Boston, you can see it. Paul, tell us about how this idea landed for you.
It was in September of 2016 or 2017 when there was a new administration in the White House, and there's a lot of nationalist rhetoric and anti-immigrant rhetoric. And I became concerned for the country that I don't want to live in a country that's nationalist and anti-immigrant and anti-brown people and anti-gay people. So I was visiting the MLK Memorial in San Francisco, which is incredibly beautiful. It's near MoMA. And I was thinking, MLK and Coretta met in Boston. They have roots here. They started their professional lives in Boston. Why don't we have something like this in Boston? And in the plane on the way home from San Fran to Boston, I wrote up a Google document with how one would pull together something like this. And it turned out to be like a 5-page document. And I'm sure it's very naive. Like, I thought I could get it done in a year. It took 6 years. But I went to hundreds of meetings for this project. We had to win over the neighborhood groups, the Art Commission, the Landmarks Commission, City Hall, and we ended up with a really beautiful structure. That the pictures are great, but for people coming to Boston, please make sure you experience in 3D, because walking under the Embrace and around it and seeing other people walk around it, it's really compelling.
You have a history of having an idea and then making something happen from it.
Yeah, I guess my girlfriend says I'm very action-oriented. I do suffer from too many ideas that every morning when my team wakes up, they're like, oh my God, how many emails are you going to get from Paul with a new idea last night? So they've developed some techniques for managing me. But yeah, I like creating, and I like being action-oriented and get stuff done.
We had Dr. Michael Freeman on the show a little while ago, and I know you know Michael, and his whole piece is the confluence of entrepreneurship and bipolarity, talking about, that folks like you are disproportionately represented amongst entrepreneurs, amongst creators.
If you are a creative person, having bipolar, if you can manage it, is an incredible blessing, because it gives you energy to work, very long hours for days and days in a row. It gives you grandiosity so that you think this idea could be a real thing, and executing and making companies and products or nonprofits involves having a vision and then seeing it as real and then making it real. And that's something that fits really well with someone who's in a hypomanic episode. So I think I designed Kayak in a hypomanic episode over months and years. And it was incredibly fun. I kept a notebook next to my bed with colored pencils, and I would wake up at 4 a.m. and draw pictures, and I would scan them. I had an old school scanner, and I would email them to the designers. We had 3 designers at Kayak, and then we'd go in and meet and talk about it and debate it. And it was incredibly fun 10 years of my life.
Amazing.
On average, during that time, Paul, how many hours of sleep per night were you getting?
So it's very different from then versus now. Back then, I was getting 3 or 4 a night. Recently, I'm treated by Dr. Maurizio Favre at MGH. He's been my psychiatrist for 20 years now. And he has me on a drug, which technically is an antipsychotic, and I've never been psychotic, but it has been shown to have benefits for hypomania. It's called Sapphris, Saphris. And one of the cool things about Sapphris is not only does it sort of knock me down a little bit and keep me from going too manic, it also makes me sleep. So I'm enjoying now 8 to 9 hours of sleep a night. I just love it.
So, and Paul, I hear you describe it as I was in a hypomanic period for Embrace Statue Ideas, for Kayak Ideas. Jim, do you want to give us like your definition of hypomania versus mania and see if that jives with yours, Paul?
When it's sustained like that, I wouldn't call it hypomania per se. So there's the term hyperthymia, I'm sure you've heard, just describing that sustained high. So people can have hyperthymia, and they can also have cyclic hypomania. I guess you're maybe a kind of a poster kid, Paul, for being able to have a highly productive period of time that I would call hyperthymic, and episodes in which, like you mentioned, depression came along after that period at 25. So you also have cyclic changes as well as that hyperthymia.
Yeah, that sounds accurate.
And it's, everybody's different, right, Jim? It's like, I think of bipolar now as a thumbprint. Like we all have a different thumbprint of how our bipolar works, but there's some trends like above average creativity, above average visionary. And Paul's like takes that into a good extreme. Paul, right. We were chatting a little bit before. How many nonprofits you started or working on right now?
I started 5 nonprofits, and I've started and sold 6 companies so far. And I have about 4 new companies I'm working on right now.
Wow.
On behalf of all of us, like, I don't know, everywhere in Boston, that you, it seems like pretty equally work in the service, healing, make a better world sector in the nonprofit as well as in the for-profit.
Yeah.
It's unusual.
Usually, like, if I'm speaking at a conference and they ask for a tagline, like, what's my title? I say entrepreneur and activist to sort of play on both parts of my life there. Right. They have a lot of overlap, running a nonprofit and running a for-profit. They both require good storytelling. They both require compassion and empathy. They require leadership, confidence, vulnerability, and humility. So there's a lot of things that as a leader of a nonprofit or as a for-profit that make you stronger if you have some of those things that I just mentioned. So I definitely learned from a nonprofit experience, which teaches me how to be a for-profit leader and vice versa.
Very cool. You've stood up a lot, Paul, and I and many others in our community have benefited from the Bipolar Social Club, which you founded. And I wonder if you could share with us, how this idea came to you, why you started it, and anything else about your experience of what I call BSC now, Bipolar Social Club.
So let me just think how many years ago this was. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was on a podcast with a young podcaster in New Zealand named Jake Millar, and he and I became friendly. And I think I may have mentioned the bipolar illness as part of my story during that podcast. And he didn't immediately come out and say, me too, but we started hanging out a little bit in Boston and Miami. And one time I had breakfast with him in Miami, or lunch in Miami, and he talked about his struggles being bipolar. And so we talked about that. His podcasting company was being shut down, and there was some drama with that. And he was thinking he just wants to clear his head and do something radically different around the world. So he was in the process of moving to Kenya. And I have a lot of friends in Kenya. So I was networking with my friends. And we talked about doing a podcast, sort of Pan-African, about entrepreneurship across Africa. He ended up hanging himself in Kenya, which was quite devastating for me because I was actively like mentoring this kid. And when that happened, I thought, at the time I'd created 4 nonprofits. And I'm thinking, I serve homeless populations, I do racial justice, I do education, and I've never done anything that was personal for me. So when Jake died, I decided to do something personal, and that was the Bipolar Social Club. And I wish it existed when Jake was alive, because he might still be alive if he had that sounding board and those friends who can validate him and accept him.
I think I was early on. I can't remember. It was a few years now, right, Paul?
Yeah.
And we met and I joined, and it's just rocketed in terms of both membership and engagement. Every day there's an engagement with a new idea or a new question, and it's a peer-to-peer thing, and people are very, very vulnerable. For example, I put out my question. It was like, the news, what are you doing? People are so thoughtful and kind and smart. So whenever I meet somebody new now who coming to BrainStorm who lives with bipolar, I send them to the website and I say, you can join. We've heard good things. How many people now, roughly?
I think it's about 350.
A few years ago, before we started BrainStorm Project, I did not know a single person who lived with bipolar.
Yeah.
And now I have 350 friends and a few more.
Yeah, actually, given what you've done, Paul, I can imagine that, well, in a few years, then there'll be some zeros after that.
Yeah, I think so. We've talked about, it's 364 members right now. We've talked about creating chapters in different cities, because at some point an email list with 1,000 or 5,000 people would be too much to handle. So at some point we'll break it by city or by country. One idea, and this sounds crazy, is to do it randomly and say you're on list 5 and you're going to develop friendships on list 5 and you're going to get to know those people really well.
Boston being well represented, we have had some local meetups, and I know when we did we did a Jim, you were, I think, online. We did a hybrid and in person, the first presentation of 10 minutes of the film. Right. And I put it out, and a whole bunch of Bipolar Social Club people from Boston showed up who I'd never met, which was really nice.
It's amazing.
So they're like, just, okay, we got your back. We're gonna support you.
I haven't looked at the Bipolar Social Club. In my experience in support group, smaller ones for people with mood disorders, particularly bipolar, I worry about potential misinformation about treatments, because people can say, well, this worked for me. And now we're at the level of anecdote and testimonial, which is a good place to start when you're looking for ideas, but not a good place to go when you're looking for what's the best route for me to take next. I'd like to see, a broad experience, not just one person's experience. What's it been like in the Bipolar Social Club in terms of?
So we've talked about this issue explicitly. Like occasionally people say what meds you're on. And there was a discussion a while back saying, like, I'm happy to tell people the meds I'm on, but the meds I'm on help me, but they might not help you, because we're all a little bit different. And so as long as people know that they like the personal stories, so there was a long thread about ketamine treatments. Is that useful for depression or not? And there was some real lived experience with people who went through those treatments with different outcomes. But it just, I think people are sophisticated enough on the list, at least most people, to know that these personal stories are important, but it's not a diagnosis or a prescription. You really need to be seen by a professional for that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate the fact that I've written, as you may know, a couple of websites trying to help people just learn more when they're faced with a mood disorder. So my current one is depressioneducation.org. So depressioneducation.org is supposed to help people just have more information for decision making. I have built it with the same trust that there are a lot of people out there who can absorb a lot of information and be thoughtful about how they manage it, not get carried away with one particular idea. Just try to learn a lot first before they start making decisions. So nice to hear that you've had the same trust in the people in the Bipolar Social Club.
Yeah, we've had pretty good discussions about it. One of the favorite pieces of feedback I got about the club is we have a young man in LA who messaged a group at one point and he said, I love my psychiatrist, but she's not bipolar.
Right.
And so she doesn't 100% understand me. He goes, but you guys have walked the same streets as me and you've seen what I've seen. And I can be in the middle of a manic episode and be vulnerable and disclose to the group the crazy thing I did last night that I have deep regrets about this morning. And when people do that, they're flooded with love.
Mm-hmm.
Often the case when someone is struggling, you get email after email saying, this is my cell phone number, call me. This is my number, call me. So it's an incredibly supportive group where people feel comfortable to be vulnerable because they know that they'll be validated and they'll be supported.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, we never had anything like this. Like I was saying, because of the stigma, I think people are not out. We don't share. We don't tell each other in the past. And having this forum is really wonderful, and other, peer groups now that are starting to emerge.
Paul, what has been your experience with being out with bipolar? When did you first cross that threshold, and what's it been like since?
It's mostly been a good thing for me. Someone pointed out that it's easier for me to be out because I've had some very public successes. And so people say, like, you're not completely incompetent. The disease hasn't, rendered you incompetent. You're able to still create things while suffering from the disease at time. My advice to people who are struggling with a mental health issue, depression, anxiety, mood disorder, or an addiction issue is there's no healing in secrecy. So you need to start to tell people. What I would say is pick 3 people, one family member, one friend, one colleague, and tell them your secrets. And say, I have a mood disorder, which sometimes I act erratically. And these are some things I've done, which I'm embarrassed about. And if you could keep an eye on me. And when you do that, people will lean in, like they will want to help you if you pick the right people. And that's, to me, that's step 1 in healing, is having a few people who will unburden you and who will validate you.
I love that advice. Yeah, that's beautiful because it takes a while. I mean, my personal story was 25 years between first episode and diagnosis, but 40 years between first episode and coming out with my story because of fear of the stigma. Paul, I'm just wondering, so you mentioned your episode and diagnosis. How bad can it get for you? Like, what's at risk if you don't take care of yourself? Have you had relapse?
I'm depressed. I'm trapped on my bedroom floor for days. I can't even get on the bed. I just collapse on the floor. I stare at the windowsill to try to figure out if the light's going to come up again, if the sun will come up, because I just become completely hopeless and terrified. I have panic attacks that are almost unstoppable. I catastrophize. And so it becomes both a lethargy and a lack of energy and depression and hopelessness, but then also with these panic attacks. And I think I get the panic attack more when I'm on the hypomanic side than on the depressive side, but I've had them with both. And on the hypomanic side, I've made some really bad decisions in my life. I write big checks. I've given away, enormous amounts of money with someone I met when I was manic and said, I can help you. And I wrote them like giant checks. I once almost paid $500,000 for an abandoned lighthouse because I thought that'd be cool to own a lighthouse. And I got in this auction and bid for it. Luckily, there's someone crazier than me who outbid me. When I am hypomanic, I end up going through periods of drinking too much. And I think I use the drinking to knock down the mania. And I know that's not healthy, but that has happened to me in the past. And then like you're bipolar, mood disorder, and drinking. And it's just like a really dangerous combination. So I've learned to stay away from that.
That's great.
I used to give some of my patients kind of an emergency backup medication. Like if it starts to get bad, do this first while you're trying to get hold of me. But here's a couple of doses of like olanzapine, Zyprexa, to try to put a lid on this. So because I would hope that it would be better than alcohol, for example.
Yeah.
What have you learned that works for you? What do you do as preventive? You talked about the Buddhist path. Um,
Buddhist path has helped me significantly. Just the whole acceptance thing and comfort with uncertainty. One of Pema Chodron's books. I also have found that just by talking with people and being open about my condition helps me a lot. Bipolar Social Club's been great because there are bipolar people who validate me and they say, you're not crazy. I've had feelings like that too. And that gives me comfort knowing there are other people out there that are similar to me.
Is there any connection between season or light and dark exposure for you?
Huge, huge. Yeah, I'm very light affected. I had for many years a full spectrum light next to my computer that I would use early mornings or late at night or in the winter to give me full spectrum light. I definitely have seasonal swings, but for some reason with the two meds that I'm on now, my seasonal swings are less than they used to be.
that's awesome.
That's Saffron and one other one.
Lamictal.
I love that drug. I can't get any more though. Jim and I have been through this. They won't. Well, I'm on Lamotrigine. Lamictal is the brand name.
Yeah.
I had for 15 years, and my insurance company won't pay for it anymore. So, but I love that drug. I was telling. I mean, this is my aunt getting all the way over stigma, where I used to never tell people. Now I say I love my drug, and then see if people want to ask about that. I did that at a conference this weekend. So yeah, Jim, we've talked about other points from Dr. Supes and Dr. Trisha Supes and Holly Schwartz. They have shared with me 4 elements of bipolar care, and I made it into a diamond. And I think you have this too, Jim, which is one's medication, therapy, support networks, and then the 4th one being, your good behaviors, being it meditations, all the anti-stress stuff. So exercise, diet, anti-inflammatory diet, lifestyle, I call it. Sounds like, Paul, you're doing the medication, certainly the support network thing, therapy from time to time. Do you have other behavioral stuff that you do in the, exercise, diet, any of that kind of stuff?
So I do all 4 of those things that you just mentioned. The only other thing that I would add is that I take classes on Thursday night at Cambridge Insight Meditation Center. My teacher's name is Madeline Klein. She's wonderful. She does some classes in person, and she also does some classes on Zoom. Oh. So your listeners who are not in Boston could definitely check her out. She's been extremely helpful to me. I took a class from her once. This sounds horrible, but it was on death and dying. It was an 8-week class. We talked about sickness and death. It actually was quite spiritual because when you realize that everything in your sight is going to go away, my house is not going to be here in 1,000 years. These trees are going to die. Everything's going to change. Every person I know is going to die. And when you realize that, it actually can liberate you and can make you think about, while we have this one life, how do we want to live it? Like, what do we want to be known for? What do we want on our tombstone? And when you think about the arc of a life, just like a company needs a mission statement, I think an individual needs a mission statement as well. And we should then think about, if my mission statement is to alleviate suffering, am I spending time this week to help me get along in that path? They say the average of the 5 people you spend the most amount of time with. Well, be selective. Pick people that are going to help you on your path.
And is that your mission statement?
Alleviate suffering. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful, Paul.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
It sounds to me, Paul, as though you've discovered using meditative techniques and the wealth of the Buddhist tradition is like creates a container. It's not a break on your mind's ability to accelerate. It's more like a kind of a soft container to just allow you to steer it around a little bit.
Yeah, that resonates.
Well, I'm no Paul English. I haven't started 25 companies, 1 or 2, but I do want to share that in that spirit we just said, Jim. I've been practicing yoga since 1989. I think I'd be completely Looney Tunes without it. I mean, it definitely sets up. It's the first thing I do every morning in terms of setting what you're just saying, Jim, that sort of container, the bath. It sounds like, Paul, you've got this down to a real deep practice. I think it's really essential. I think if we put that on a Bipolar Social Club, a lot of people would say they're doing some kind of meditative, spiritual yoga, stress relieving practice.
Yeah, that can be really helpful.
And by contrast, how about a simple technological device? Sarah and I have talked about it. Paul, have you used a dawn simulator?
What's it called? No.
What about a signal that reaches your brain before you wake up at the same time every morning saying it's daytime now, and does so at the same time all the way through the year? So a dawn simulator is simply a device that turns on a bedside lamp 30 minutes gradually, over 30 minutes before you wake up. The light reaches your hypothalamus and says it's becoming light outside, and it makes it easier to wake up on a regular basis at that time. But I think it helps solidify circadian rhythm. And circadian rhythm lies behind this vulnerability to mood shifts with season and light, right?
Yeah.
So anything that solidifies circadian rhythm ought to be like that's like a mood stabilizer.
Yeah.
And the dawn simulator costs 30, 40, 50 bucks and has zero risks. What treatments do we have in psychiatry that have clear efficacy, including in randomized trials, and zero risk? So I'm a big dawn simulator fan.
Sounds great.
And I do everything that Dr. Phelps advises. So I got my $30 dawn simulator, which I love. I do love it. It gives full spectrum light. This time of year when it's, dark until 7 in the morning, it does definitely do good for my mood. The only risk is if you've got somebody that you're sleeping next to,
right, they
might not like it so much. But my guy knows what's the risk if I don't use it. So he just says, okay, whatever, I'll roll over.
Yeah.
And a footnote to that, on the other side is having a dark bedroom. So I would ask my patients, well, how dark is your bedroom? And I've been doing that for years because it seems as though having lots of darkness when it should be dark is also a mood stabilizer in terms of solidifying circadian rhythm. Well, then a study came out from one of our colleagues in Japan showing that they gave people light gizmos, a light meter, and had a bunch of people measure the light exposure that they were getting at night. So how dark is your bedroom? And found that people with higher light exposures had a higher rate of manic recurrence.
Wow. Yeah, my bedroom's all very dark. Like I put electrical tape on top of the LEDs, so there's no LEDs in my bedroom.
Right.
I have darkening curtains. I once bought 7 identical, really high quality white t-shirts, and the sleep hygiene book told me every night before you go to bed, put on a clean white t-shirt to get you in a ritual, and then darken the room.
Yeah.
Paul, you got to go. You have to go run 5 nonprofits and 6 businesses. So we're really honored and grateful to have your time this morning. Is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with, just in terms of like, a message of hope or any other words of wisdom about
I think the big thing is just don't suffer alone. Find a friend to talk with. That's step 1 in healing.
Okay.
Good.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and for everything you're doing for our community. Really appreciate you. Nice to see you again. Stay healthy and whole.
How fun.
I'm so touched by everything he's done. Of course, in the for-profit entrepreneurial world, it's cool, kayak and, sold it for like $1 billion or something. But the Embrace statue, for example, is so moving. He says he's a white heterosexual male of privilege, and he's using that privilege to do some really beautiful things in this world. So grateful to Paul. It was cool to get to chat with him today.
Yeah. His tagline, alleviate suffering.
That's his mission, he said, alleviate suffering. And don't do this alone, which also reminds me of Terry Chaney's, another one of our guests, phrase that I just love, and which is, the disease feeds on shame feeds on silence, and I will not be silent anymore.
Oh.
So we have to have this community piece is just huge. For any of our listeners out there who might be living with bipolar, jump on Bipolar Social Club. It's very helpful, and we'll put that in the show notes. All right. Well, take care till next time.
Thanks so much for joining us on BrainTalk, our bipolar spectrum podcast. BrainTalk is a program of BrainStorm, a multi-platform project about the bipolar spectrum, which includes Sara Schley's memoir and a full-length documentary coming in 2025. We aim to save lives, crush stigma, and maximize healing for all people living with bipolar and those who love them. For more information, head to www.brainstormthefilm.com. To call in to a future episode and ask questions, go to brainstormthefilm.com/podcasts.